All right, so now let me bring the bishop. The bishop is also going to move in a straight line, but the bishop actually is the piece that moves through the diagonals. The rook we said moved through files and ranks. Well, the bishop is the one that moves through the diagonals, and that's it. That's all you have to know. Just like the rook, just like the queen, just like the king, the bishop cannot jump over other pieces. He cannot move to squares where his old pieces are set up, but as long as he is clear, he can move diagonally one step, two steps, all the way to the end of the board. So let me highlight the squares you could move to. And it is important to mention that bishops, they never switch color, meaning that if this bishop starts on a dark square, he can never switch to a light square. So he's going to be on the dark squares for the whole game. And the same thing, if I bring another bishop and I put it on this light square, you will never see this specific bishop switching to a dark square. It cannot happen. And that's why he goes diagonally. This one goes through the light squares, the other bishop is going to go through the dark squares. Now, just for you to see the contrast between the rook and the bishop, let me bring the two pieces on the board. So I'm going to put the bishop here. This bishop is going to move diagonally, while the rook is going to move side to side, up and down. So I hope this becomes clear. I'm sorry that I keep repeating the same thing over and over, but I really want you to get it clear before we move on to the next piece. And now we only have two more pieces to learn, the knight and the pawn. So let's get it done. So here we have the knight. I'm going to put it in the middle of the board. There are two ways to learn how to move the knight. I'm going to teach you the way that I learned, and I'm going to teach you the way that I teach my younger students. So the way that I learned was that the knight moves 3 steps in L shape. So think of the capital L, and the knight is going to move like that 3 steps. So what does that mean? Well, this knight could move 1, 2, and 3. So if you think about it, this is the L shape. It's going to be 3 steps in total in L shape. 1, 2, 3. But of course, the knight could move up, down, side to side as long as you do this the L shape. The knight is the only piece that doesn't move in a straight line. So let me show you all of the different squares the knight could move to using this technique. So I could move down and to the right, down and to the left. So these 2 squares the knight could jump to. I could also go to the side and then down, to the side and up. I could move to the left and down. I could move to the left and up. And of course I could move up to the right and up to the left. So these are the squares that the knight can jump to. When the knight is in the middle of the board, he could move to 8 different squares. Now if we put the knight, let's say he goes to the edge, he doesn't have 8 squares to move to anymore. He only has 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that's how the knight moves. And if I bring it, let's say I'm going to bring it back to the center, there's one more thing that I want you to notice, and it's the fact that the knight, he always switches colors, meaning that he jumps from a dark square to a light square. So any square that he jumps to from here is going to be a light square. Now if I move it, let's say here, 1, 2, and 3. Now once he moves again from here, since he's sitting on a light square, he's going to move to a dark square. So that's another way for you to make sure you're moving it in the right way. So let me put it back here and show you the other way that you can learn the knight. If it's getting too complicated like this way, or you want to break it down for someone else, you could say that the knight moves 1 step like the rook and 1 step like the bishop, or 1 step like the bishop and 1 step like the rook. So if you start going in this direction, going up, you can move 1 step like the rook, 1 step like the bishop, and it's the same thing as going 3 steps in L shape. If you do it down, you could go 1 step like the rook, 1 step like the bishop, and it's the same thing as going 3 steps in L shape. Same thing to the side, 1 step like the rook, 1 step like the bishop. So that's how the knight moves. There is something else very cool about the knight, and it is the fact that the knight is the only piece in chess that is allowed to jump over other pieces. I've been telling you all this time about the rook, the bishop, the king, and the queen, how they cannot jump over other pieces. Well, the knight can. So let me put all of the pieces from the very beginning. So they're just set up, ready to start the game. You're going to see how, if I wanted to move this rook, the rook cannot move right now. Same thing for the bishop. He could go diagonally, but there's a pawn going this way. There's a pawn going this way, so he's stuck. The king moves one step in every direction, but in every direction that he wants to move right now, there's a piece blocking him. The queen is so powerful, but at the very beginning, it cannot move anywhere since there are pieces surrounding her. But the knights could just jump over pieces. So if we go in L shape, 3 steps, I could go 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3. So I could jump to any of these 2 squares. If I want to move it like the rook and then like the bishop, I could go 1 step like the rook, 1 step like the bishop. Now, just to give you an example, let me show you this random position, and we're going to be using the knights. So I'm going to start by moving this knight, and he could go 1, 2, 3. He could jump over the pawn and be developed. And let's say the black pieces move this knight. He could go 1, 2, 3. And then I move this other knight. I'm going to put it, this time I'm going to go to the side. I'm going to go 1 like the rook, 1 like the bishop. Then let's say this knight goes 1, 2, 3. Now, if I wanted to move this knight, I could jump over this pawn, 1, 2, 3, and it's okay. Or I could go to the side. I could go 1, 2, jump over my own pawn, and I could go here. So that's it. Just make sure that the square where the knight is going to land is available. So I hope this explains how the knight moves. And again, don't worry too much about it if it's still confusing. We're going to be doing so many exercises that you're going to get it in no time. And last but not least, we have the pawns. And pawns are also pretty easy to learn because pawns move only straight forward. These are the only pieces that can never go backward. And pawns are actually going to move 1 or 2 steps at a time, no more than that. Now the trick is to know when the pawn can move 1 step and when he could move both. So let's get to it. Pawns are going to move, like I said, 1 step forward. That's what they could do, except for when they are at the very beginning. If one of your pawns have never moved, then that pawn has the right to move 2 steps. But once a pawn moves, then that pawn can only continue 1 step at a time. The way I explain it to my younger students, I tell them that pawns at the very beginning are full of energy, so they could do 1 step or 1 and 2, but once they move, let's say I move this pawn here, then the pawn loses energy and he continues 1 step at a time. So let me bring it back and let's take a look at some examples. So if I wanted to move this pawn, the question is, has this pawn moved before? No. So he's at the beginning square, and that means he could move 1 step or he could move 2 steps. I'm going to choose to move him 2 steps this time, and then it's the black pieces to move, and they're going to move this pawn. They're going to move it 1, then I'm going to choose this pawn. I'm going to move it 2 steps. Let's say they move this pawn 2 steps. Now, if I wanted to move any of these 2 pawns, I can only move it 1 step. There's no 2 steps anymore. Now, any of the other pawns, they could, of course, do 1 or 2 because they haven't moved. So I'm going to choose this pawn. I'm going to move it once. And then same thing for the black pieces. If they want to move this pawn, it has to be 1 step only. He already moved. He lost energy. This other pawn, has he moved? Yes. So only 1 step at a time. Any of the other pawns who are at the very beginning, they have the right to still do 1 or 2 steps. That's it. So that's how the pawn moves. Just remember, straight forward, pawns cannot move to their sides. Pawns that cannot just start marching diagonal. They move forward, 1 or 2 steps. Okay, everyone, if you've made it this far, we can say you have almost all of the foundation. Most of the pieces capture the same way they move. So it's going to be very easy. Next class should take us only a few minutes. This one took us a little bit longer because I wanted to make sure you understood everything about how to move the pieces. It didn't make sense to just go over a few pieces in this lesson and break it down. This way we got all of the pieces out of the way. And again, next class, few minutes, you're going to learn how the pieces move. Then you're going to learn check and checkmate. It's just a concept you have to understand. And at that point, you will be able to play your first game. So don't give up, and I'll see you in the next lesson.